Okay, really sorry about the technical difficulties. We'll give it a few just another minute to let everybody join in, and then we will get started.
AJ, can you allow me to share the screen, please?
You got it.
Okay. Well, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our newest Masterclass series. We're really excited to have everyone join us today. Today I'm joined by my co-host Graham. Graham, do you want to go ahead and just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm Graham Brooks, one of the solutions architects with Syxsense. I also tend to spend a lot of my time vulnerability management, patch management, and compliance. It's where most of my work resides. And today we're going to talk a lot about some very specific, very high priority vulnerabilities.
Thank you, Graham. And I'm Rob Brown. I'm head of customer success here at Syxsense from our UK head office. We've been delivering patch management services, including vulnerability remediation, for over 10 years, and we've deployed over 100 million patches worldwide. So to start with, I'd like to go through an introduction of what the terminology of vulnerability management means, because there is a misconception that vulnerability management is purely patch management. And so we're just going to define something to help you understand all of the words and terminologies that we're going to use today. And I know that Graham has done some fantastic research on the 6 vulnerabilities that you should be remediating right now. So the threat actor used CVE 2021-44228, a vulnerability with a CVSS score of 10.0 to completely compromise a server. So that is what you probably are familiar with when you see a news announcement come through, whether that's through the Google, or you have security feeds, or in fact, like us, you have access to Microsoft Threat Intelligence. And so it's very important that we just analyze this kind of terminology to understand what each of these mean when it's related to the vulnerability in its bigger picture. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the threat actor. Now, there is a misconception here that threat actors are always trying to steal your data, that they're trying to access your environment, they're trying to cause damage. That is true, and there are certainly cyber terrorists, and these are probably some of the worst ones. But you also have the other side. The threat actors are actually there for the greater good. They're trying to provide the vendors the vulnerabilities in advance that should be remediated by those vendors. And if they don't remediate those vulnerabilities within a certain period of time, they say that they will announce to the internet how exactly they were able to expose the vulnerability. And of course, it's up to the vendor then to decide whether the vulnerability is worth it. But it's very important that not all of those cyber threats are the good guys. And actually, some of the threats we've seen take place, especially since Ukraine and Russia, is that yes, there is ransomware when there's a monetary gain, but actually there's also a lot of destruction. They simply want to turn devices into expensive doorstops. And so we just need to understand where the threat comes from can be a very important indicator as to how you're going to prioritize the threat. And then we're going to talk about the vulnerability. And again, there is a huge misconception right now with vulnerabilities, because when I speak to my clients, and indeed we get so many emails to us after each of our Patch Tuesday webinars, or in fact, Graham joins me and does a fantastic Linux webcast. We get so many questions around patch management that actually vulnerabilities are assumed to be patches. And this is simply not the case. So when we talk about a vulnerability, we're talking about something that is impacting an operating system or a piece of software, or actually a configuration of the operating system. This can affect both Windows and Linux and Mac OS as well. And the vulnerability itself is actually the entry point, you might say. It is the thing, it is the bug in the software that allows somebody to use that bug to either access your environment or to spread something within your organization. And that can be as simple as accessing a single device, a local network, or a company-wide network. So it's very important that we understand that the vulnerability isn't just a patch. It is actually the code, the bug, or the configuration that allows an exploit to take place. And we're probably familiar with Patch Tuesday because it comes around every single month. Patch Tuesday is repeated several times, in fact, each month. But we have this this threat called a 0 day, and the 0 days can happen at any time. And it might be an upgrade of software. It might, in fact, be a configuration issue. And it's very important that we understand that not all vulnerabilities are treated the same. Lots of vulnerabilities where the vendor provides the fix, they will provide you a patch. But some vulnerabilities, the vendor doesn't provide you anything. And you need a systems management or security vulnerability remediation solution that can close those gaps. So it's very important that we understand that not everything is patchable, and some remediations need a very intelligent mindset when it comes to fixing those gaps. And then we're going to talk about the CVE. Now, we talked about that number, that long number that was used in that reference. Now, the CVE is the Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures number, and it is unique to the vulnerability. Now, what is interesting here is that a patch that Microsoft releases, so there's one patch, may actually resolve lots of CVEs. So you may actually end up resolving lots of vulnerabilities in one single patch. But each of those vulnerabilities will have their own unique number. And normally what happens is the vendor themselves will acknowledge that a vulnerability exists, and they will detail exactly how that vulnerability exists and how it's remediated, if in fact there is a remediation, and they will publish that to a very independent database. So you can see all of the CVEs that are created for all of the vendors across. But what is very important is that that is a totally unique number, and that allows you to search your environment for that CVE. And if you have it, whether or not we're recommending that you prioritize that today, if your toolset has the capability of taking a CVE, please use that. It is the universal ID for all vulnerabilities. Almost lastly, we talk about the CVSS score. Now, the CVSS score has evolved over many years, many years. I remember using CVSS scores 2.0 over almost 10 years ago, when it was simply critical, high, and low. And CVSS scores are there to provide an independent score for the vulnerability itself. The vendor can provide a vulnerability severity, critical, high, medium, low, and they obviously have their own way of scoring that particular vulnerability. But there is an independent organization called NIST, and they will build a score out of 10 based on a very important calculation. And these are the calculation group metrics that we're about to talk about. Now, the CVSS score, as I said, is out of 10, and it's very granular. So we go 10, 9.9, 9.8, 9.7. We have a lot of granularity, and it helps to have It helps in the independent scoring of a vulnerability if you have something more than everything is critical. If something is 9.9 and something is 9.1, you have an independent score there to say which one is more important than the other. Now we have 3 groups here, and this is actually why CVSS is now 3.1. So it was 2.0 when I was first introduced to it. So the basic metric group, or the base score, is a series of factors that allow you to create the score out of 10. The first of which is the attack vector. So how can the vulnerability be exposed? Is it across the network? Is it across any network, including across the internet? Is it something you can only exploit when you have physical access to the device? We have the attack complexity. So how many hoops do you need to jump through in order to expose? Privileges required. So if the user was to click something, could they in fact infect the system? Or does it need some more lower level admin privileges? To user interaction. So does the user have to do something? Do they have to be part of the story of the exploit? And lastly, the scope. The scope is one of the most important metrics here because it means that the vulnerability can break out of its code and into potentially another part of the technology. So in the example, if the Google Chrome browser had a scope of yes or true, we call this a jump point. It means it can jump out of Google Chrome and into the operating system and move sideways across. So this is very, very important. This is a very excellent scoring system, and we use a lot of this at Syxsense because it helps to create a lot of clarity. Now, as we move rightwards, we're talking about the temporal metric group and the environmental metric group. This is the kind of remediation that exists. Is there a report of the vulnerability being exploited? How simple is the remediation, for example? Now, the base score on the left is the highest score it can be. So if the base score on the left is say 9.5, then the calculation from the temporal metric group and the environmental metric group can only reduce the score, not increase it, and that's very important. So we always use the base score as the highest of the 3. We think that that is right because we don't know your environment. And in fact, if we take a look at the environmental metric group, that was added really at the last moment. That's been improved massively. That means different types of organization in your verticals. So you might be in finance, you might be in oil and gas exploration, for example. You may have to pay particular attention based on those verticals. So the score is a very complex, very robust way of saying which vulnerability is more important than others. And as I said, it goes from 10 down to 0. So 10 would be the equivalent of critical, 0 would be the equivalent of NA. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my co-host Graham. I know you've done some fantastic research into these, and already I'm getting quite excited about this list of what we've just learned. At the very least, should be very interesting. So Graham, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. Cool. So anytime you make a list, someone is going to disagree with that list. And frankly, I welcome that disagreement, and I encourage you to send me any other vulnerabilities you would like me to cover. The reality is, though, thousands of high priority vulnerabilities are discovered every month. If we were to attempt to make a comprehensive list, we would be here for months. So rather than trying to be comprehensive, I've targeted a few particularly infamous vulnerabilities. My requirements for that target are as follows. First, the vulnerability must have a CVSS score of at least 8. Second, the vulnerability must have had a severe industry impact. And then third, the vulnerability must be still relevant today. So here's our list ranked in no particular order. SMB version 1.0 with a CVSS score of 8.1 at number 1. Then we have Print Nightmare with a CVSS score of 8.8. Then the record-breaking Log4j coming in at around 10. Then we have the vSphere client RCE with a score of 9.8. Bluekeep, the infamous remote desktop flaw with a score of 10. And finally, we're going to talk about that at the end. There's a surprise. So first on our list, SMB version 1. On Tuesday, June 27th, 2017, Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world at the time, went completely dark. The whole company was offline. All their IT systems were down. That started on June 27th, the largest IT disaster recovery project in history, at least up to that point. Maersk had unwittingly signed up for a massive crypto malware and erasure campaign. They signed up for this breach by not adequately patching against CVE 2017-0143, a CVSS score of 8.1 vulnerability. 2017-0143 is a flaw affecting the SMB service in older versions of Windows ecosystem operating systems. SMB stands for server message block, and it's a primary mode of internetworking for Windows assets. SMB is a core protocol for Windows domain servicing and file sharing, and has been around forever. Version 1 of the protocol was published back in 1984. Nowadays, SMB 3.1 is the standard, and version 1 is entirely deprecated, and it has been for a very long time. But unfortunately, version 1 is also the communications backbone for many legacy software and hardware products, some of which are prohibitively expensive to replace, and in some cases, there is no upgrade path. You can't replace it. In these use cases, most sysadmins opt to put devices requiring SMB version 1 on a special network with severe firewall restrictions, so that the vulnerabilities associated with version 1 can't be exploited by threat actors. Unfortunately, Maersk didn't do that. Around June 27th, the ransomware group Sandworm gained access to a single computer within Maersk's Ukrainian office. This computer was accessed through a supply chain breach when a trusted software package was installed with a malware payload. The Sandworm threat actor was assumed to be a government-sponsored group backed by the Russians as part of their ongoing territorial conflict in Ukraine. Maersk is not a Ukrainian company, but they have operations all over the world. There's no indication that Sandworm was directly targeting Maersk. It just happens that Maersk unintentionally chose to use a malware-infected tax management software. Once the malware affected just one device on the network, the payload of that malware used 2017-0143 to populate itself over Maersk's entire network. Sandworm's CVE exploit used a bug in SMB version 1, which allows unauthenticated, elevated remote code execution on any endpoint available over the network. Essentially, they had free access to any endpoint within Maersk as soon as they had entry onto one device in their network. In the case of Sandworm, their goal wasn't money, but destruction of assets. Sandworm based their attack on a known malware product, Petya. But Petya is built to encrypt systems and then display a prompt to send Bitcoin for a decryption key. That's classic ransomware. The ransomware that Sandworm built used Petya but provides no option for decryption. Their version was hence named Not Petya. Not Petya was able to completely decimate Maersk's enterprise, encrypting almost all of their IT assets. Thankfully, and also luckily, one of their data centers located in South Africa was temporarily offline for repairs and didn't get hit by the malware. Using that data center and 11 days of disaster recovery and $300 million in repairs, Maersk was back online. Maersk has stated that their 11 days of missed deliverables in business lost the company $264 million in revenue. Sometimes all it takes is a single asset, just one infected device to bring a Titan down. Worst Maersk was just one of over 2,000 organizations compromised by NotPetya and Sandworm. Don't let CVE 2017-0143 bring down your environment. It's frankly really easy to fix. Upgrade your legacy products, remove old operating systems, and then, if necessary, the harder part, create security risk assessments, and asset plans for the business critical IT assets that you can't replace or upgrade. If you wouldn't mind. Oh, Rob, I can't hear you. That might be on my end. One moment.
No, that's my end, sorry.
Okay,
Also,
cool.
so if you're not able to remove legacy software, would you just recommend like sandboxing them as best as possible so that they can't be, you don't have a lateral attack?
Absolutely. That is the preferred method of defense.
Yep, awesome.
Cool. So on this slide, we have a little bit of information about this particular CVE. We can see that it's a network-based attack. It has high complexity for the attack, which is a good thing. We don't want an easy attack vector, but it doesn't require any privileges to execute, which is horrible. There's no user interaction required. The one good thing here is that the scope is unchanged, which means it can't move from SMB over to another service. But frankly, in this particular case, it doesn't have to, so it doesn't really matter. The major components that's going to frustrate are your confidentiality. It's going to affect your integrity, your availability, and because of all of those things, it has a CVSS score of 8.1. Awesome. Let's move on to Print Nightmare. And frankly, this is as much a story of the vulnerability as it is a story about the response to the vulnerability. On June 8th, 2021, Microsoft released a low priority security patch for CVE 2021-1675. It was a minor security flaw which they found in the print spooler service, which needed to be addressed. It allowed for privilege escalation, but only on the local device, and it was hard to execute with a bunch of prerequisite conditions. But between June 8th and July 1st, researchers uncovered a cripplingly powerful exploit using a similar path to CVE 2021-1675. They gave this new flaw the identity 2021-34527. This exploit was way easier to exercise and didn't require the prerequisites. The researchers named the vulnerability Print Nightmare. It was an appropriate name. The Windows Print Spooler is two things. It's a client service, which allows endpoints to print documents from themselves and schedule print work. But it's also a server-side service, which provides endpoint access to network printers. This new vulnerability uses both the client and server-side services. First, using a flaw on the client side, the Print Nightmare can give local user account access to the Windows system account, which then has administrative permissions on the endpoint. Then using a flaw on the server-side service, Print Nightmare can be used to remotely execute code on another endpoint. Finally, the code that's executed on the other endpoint can be crafted to provide the threat actor with system-level permissions, again, using the client-side service a second time. This back-and-forth process can be iterated until the attacker has full permissions on all assets on a common network. At that point, they have an endless number of ways to take full advantage of their new power. On July 1st, Microsoft released a new patch for this exploit and moved on. Problem solved. But it got worse. The researchers who found the more severe vulnerability affecting the server-side print spooler error figured out a way around the patch Microsoft released on July 1st, and then they released their proof of concept hack to GitHub, thus making the vulnerability into a publicly known exploit with a full-on pre-built implementation ready to be used. No work required. This created a massive emergency for pretty much every IT organization on Earth. At this point in time, the only way to fix Print Nightmare was to turn off the print spooler on all assets. This caused a huge number of problems for every company using printers as part of their business. Thankfully, 2 days later on July 7th, Microsoft released an emergency out-of-band patch to fix Print Nightmare, which is awesome. Microsoft to the rescue. But unfortunately, in their reasonable haste to get a patch out to their customers, Microsoft were unable to go through their normal quality control process. And in doing so, the general population became the quality control for the patch, and it wasn't pretty. Some organizations with third-party print vendors were completely unable to use their printers. This caused a secondary emergency as printer vendors scrambled to craft driver updates for their customers. And then it got worse again. The full force of the cybersecurity industry was now analyzing the print spooler with a freaking microscope, and more issues kept cropping up. Apparently, all the fixes crafted by Microsoft for 2021-34527 become useless if the print and point setting within print spooler is enabled. And a lot of people use and need that service to be turned on. So Microsoft crafted another update to fix point and print. But then it got worse again. Now that the cybersecurity industry is ripping apart print spooler looking for vulnerabilities, they find a brand new escalation of privileges vulnerability within the same service. Finally, on August 10th, Microsoft released one final update for the spooler, which rolls up fixes for the point and print workaround, as well as the new escalation of privileges flaw. And then this August 10th printing patch broke printing again, forcing organizations to scramble to perform driver update patching. It was probably one of the worst printing fiascos, not even just printing, worst patching fiascos in the history of IT. And that is the saga.
I completely agree, Graham. And in fact, you know what's interesting about that was that the first patch that they released to address the vulnerability was critical in nature. They didn't recall that patch. They released a NA, or an optional, this is what they called it, an optional patch to fix the first one. But if you've got like automatic WSUS patching, it would always install the criticals, but would leave the end user to decide whether they want the optional. So there was no way of forcing out a deployment unless you had a tool that could literally push out updates.
Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of where I'm going here too. All of this process could have been easily avoided with a tool, one perhaps like ours, that would manage the print patching process for you, and then also help understand when issues are cropping up, like pulling a patch so that it can't be pushed if there are significant issues with that content, which definitely was the case with Print Nightmare. So moving to the actual vulnerability itself. It's a network-based vulnerability, so that's bad. It's very easy to execute because they gave everyone the instructions on how to execute it. There are very low privileges required, no user interaction. On the good side, scope is unchanged, so it can only use the print spooler, but that's kind of a misnomer because everything has the print spooler on it. Confidentiality is affected at a high level, so is integrity and availability. Therefore, this has a CVSS score of 8.8. All right, so the next item on our list is about as famous as you can get. It is Log4j, and we have to kind of give you a brief history before we get there. Java is a super important platform. It's one of the first tools that was built to allow people to create code regardless of what system they're running. So the previous paradigm was you build code around hardware. You've got mainframes, and then you deploy code that works for that particular mainframe manufacturer. And it worked well for its time, but it was clunky, and you couldn't take someone's cool idea and then transport it over to a different lab, a different university to do work. And Java is one of the implementations that was built to address that problem. The problem with Java being so easy to implement is if there are problems affecting an application built in Java, it has the opportunity to affect a lot of different kinds of environments. But let's get even worse. What if the issue isn't the application? What if the problem is actually with Java itself? a core function. And that's where Log4j comes in. Log4j is the logging service used by Java. It literally means logger for Java. Pretty much all applications built on Java, which have logging as part of the product, will use it. In fact, the current estimate is that 95% of all Java-based apps use Log4j. The Log4j vulnerability was first discovered by the Minecraft community. Older versions of Minecraft ran directly on Java, and there was a rumor that started circulating that someone was remotely taking over people's computers using the in-game chat function. That's super weird, and it got people's attention very fast. Surprisingly, it was confirmed that in fact was happening, and then reality hit. The issue was caused in how the Log4j service incorrectly interpreted inputs from the chat box in Minecraft. But Log4j is not a Minecraft thing, it's everywhere. More importantly, Log4j is an Apache. And Apache is the most popular web providing service in the world. And obviously, it's public facing. So this vulnerability went from that's interesting to essentially the end of the world overnight. Anyone with a computer could run a script to check if your website was running Apache. And if so, they could then check to see if it could be exploited using Log4j. And they did. Tons of threat actors came out of the woodwork to test corporate networks and publicly available websites. The release of Log4j saw the advent of the largest increase in offensive cybersecurity monitoring in history. Many companies were compromised. Massive amounts of data was stolen. And at this point, at least 46% of corporate networks have undergone some form of attack using Log4j as the initial attack vector. A further 26% of corporations have undergone business disruptions in some capacity as part of those attacks. Now, here's where it gets messier. Java-based binary applications are super easy to build. That's part of why Java is so popular and cool. It's also what makes this vulnerability so dangerous. It's not easy to tell what applications are affected by the vulnerability because they're binaries. Everything's kind of packaged behind the scenes. So you can't tell which ones have this and don't have it in the background running. The official advisory by Hunter Labs, which is one of the most respected threat hunting organizations in the world, is to simply treat all applications based on Java to be impacted by Log4j. If it has Java, it must be updated or removed, or you risk having your devices and networks completely compromised. Because of this ongoing hunt for old Java binaries, it's estimated that 30% of organizations in the world maintain applications which are still exploitable using the Log4j flaw. On the bright side, Log4j is actually simple in theory to fix. If the software is under active support from the vendor, update to the latest version, you're done. And that's generally the recommendation provided by most vendors. The problem, obviously, is if the software is no longer supported or there is no vendor, then frankly, you have to find another solution. Or you could take the SMB version 1 approach where you put it behind a sandbox environment and don't let the devices have access outside of their critical function.
Yeah, Graham, I remember this when it happened. The messaging around the news was if you have Log4j in your environment, you've probably already been hacked. That's what they were saying, right? And that was because this is so popular across the whole world that you know, it was fair game. If your machines were on the internet, you probably had been at least had some attempt of a hack.
Yeah, this is absolutely. Yeah, I have a friend who's a manager in a cybersecurity organization, and he looked like a ghost. I didn't see him for a solid month during the last part of 2021 and 2022, and he was rough. It was a bad experience for a lot of people. And as you can see here, there's a good reason why.
Yeah.
The attack vector, it's a network attack, low complexity, no privileges required, no user interaction required. Scope is changed so it can go from its home and spread out to other products and services. It has full impact to confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and it is a 10.0 CVSS score.
You know, we see 10s. We used to see 10s quite regular several years ago, but I think vendors now are much better at sort of proactively fixing their bugs. That when you see a 10, you know it's really bad. You need
Yes.
a sort of react as quickly as you possibly can.
Absolutely. All right. Next on our list is one that's actually not quite as scary. It's still bad. It's not quite as scary. I say that because it has a CVSS score of 9.8. So the vSphere RCE. vSphere is a major component for many on-prem data centers. vSphere provides a centralized environment for managing virtualized environments and servers. It's comprised of two primary components: a central server providing management, and a second agent, which is installed on each server blade. The agent on the server blade communicates back to the central server, and then the central server provides work to the blade. At the beginning of 2021, VMware released an advisory alerting their customers to a severe vulnerability, 2021-21972, which would allow a threat actor to execute arbitrary code against the web console of the vSphere product. Because of this arbitrary code execution, the attacker could then use their new access to traverse the VMware cluster and take control of assets at scale. Along with the advisory, VMware also released a patch to resolve the CVE. But two things are true about patches. First, they can be hard to schedule, especially on critical infrastructure. And second, the bad guys are generally faster than the good guys. Furthermore, in some business cases, VMware vSphere can be a web-facing product which can be accessed by the public using correct credentials. Well, because of the remote code execution flaw, correct credentials were no longer required. Threat actors began spamming the internet with requests looking for vSphere environments, and they found a lot of them. Within a single day of the advisory, vSphere clusters began crashing, and system administrators were having to choose between purposefully taking their company's infrastructure offline or having someone else do it for them. To this day, it's unclear just how much damage was done from 2021-21972, but we do know that 100% of vSphere environments were affected at the time of the advisory. Furthermore, over 15,000 clusters existed as web-facing consoles, and of those 15,000 clusters, most were impacted, including some owned by Fortune 500 companies. Resolving this vulnerability today should not be a large concern. Simply make sure that your VMware environment has the latest patches. That's it. If you're running VMware Sphere without updates, make sure that your cluster is updated as soon as you can, and that it's not web accessible. So this flaw, if it's in your environment, it's essentially instant death, but keeping it out of your environment should be very simple. So looking at this from the CVSS score perspective, see that it's a network-based exploit. It has low complexity, no privileges required, no user interaction required. It can change scope, so it can jump from one context to another. It has high impact across the board, availability, confidentiality, and integrity. So it does have a very high score of 9.8. Cool. So next on our list, we have Bluekeep. This one is also pretty darn famous. This is an issue with the remote desktop protocol from Microsoft. RDP is cool, it's useful. It allows a user from one computer to log into a different computer if they have the right username and password associated with that other device. At least that's how it's supposed to work. But vulnerabilities are what happen when what is supposed to work and how it actually works are two separate things. On May 14th, 2019, the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre sent an urgent vulnerability report to Microsoft. They had uncovered a critical flaw in the RDP tool, which allows an unauthenticated user to remotely execute code on a computer system. On the 17th of May, Microsoft released an out-of-band urgent security patch for 2019-07-08, resolving that vulnerability. But not only did they release an out-of-band update for their currently supported operating systems, they also went back in time and released an update for their discontinued products as well. Vista, XP, 7, they all saw updates for protection against this vulnerability. Microsoft providing updates for end-of-life products is incredibly rare. It's actually only happened a couple of times. At first, Bluekeep was a hard to implement vulnerability, and while extremely severe in impact, the likelihood of a threat actor having the knowledge and skill required to implement was highly unlikely. And that remained true for a few months. And then researchers started uploading their proof of concept hacks to GitHub. We all know that it's inappropriate to spoil the ending of a popular movie before it comes out. It's also inappropriate to release details of an exploit right after the vulnerability is released. But in the same way that we do know that Dumbledore dies in the Half-Blood Prince, at a certain point, people, even responsible people, are going to start talking about the methods of exploiting a vulnerability. And once that happens, threat actors who may not be as technically gifted are still going to be listening in to that public forum. And as soon as the proof of concept starts filtering out, enterprise organizations get hit by ransomware attacks. In this case, it was ransomware, crypto mining, botnets, and a bunch of other types of payloads. What's amazing to me, though, is Bluekeep is really easy to fix. It has a single patch associated with it, and you can install it anywhere, regardless of your licensing with Microsoft. It's free. The patch doesn't change functionality, and you can deploy it all the way back to Windows XP. But as of May 2020, there were still 600,000 internet accessible devices with an active Bluekeep vulnerability. It's estimated that approximately 50% of devices affected by Bluekeep have not yet been patched. And a scary number of those assets are critical infrastructure devices. Bluekeep is one of those issues which boggles my mind. There's no valid reason for an organization to not be patched against it, yet it persists and people are still being compromised from it today. If you're not sure whether your organization has been fully remediated against the Bluekeep vulnerability, please let us know. Reach out to us and we'd be happy to help with that.
And at the very least, change the ports, the default ports that you're using for RDP. Don't give them such an easy target. Once again, that vulnerability is something we can help you identify on your internet-facing servers. Should you want to start a trial?
And as with our previous vector we were looking at, it's a network-based attack. Low complexity, no privileges, no user interaction. In this case, scope is unchanged, which is kind of a modestly good thing in this case. Unchanged scope, though, really only matters if it's a service that's not in high use. RDP exists everywhere, so frankly, it doesn't matter. Confidentiality, high, integrity high, availability high, with a CVSS score of 9.8. Okay, let's talk about our last item. And I picked this out on purpose because I want to make sure that we understand what a vulnerability is, because there's a lot more to it than just CVEs and CVSS scores. Account management. So we've talked about permissions before in our master classes, and we'll continue to talk about them in the future. Not everything that can be used in attack has to have a distinct CVE associated with it. We saw this in the Colonial Pipeline incident. No special work was done to penetrate their network. The attackers simply logged in. The reality is that time is money, and that's even true for cybersecurity criminals. Why should you invest hundreds of hours into a complex attack when you can buy login credentials at $1 per account? And that rate does get cheaper if you buy in bulk. So on average, most companies have somewhere between 100 and 1,000 stale user accounts still present in their domain. That's up to 1,000 potential opportunities for a threat actor to buy their way into your space. Today, 32% of all cybersecurity attacks are implemented with known user account permissions as the initial compromise. And it's just not mom and pops anymore. It's also Fortune 500 companies. 21 million accounts within Fortune 500 companies are currently available for sale on the dark web. Most of them are probably not valid anymore, but you need one. So if 1 in 21 million are valid, then you have a compromised Fortune 500 company. And that is the main takeaway I want to leave you with today. We saw it with the SMB flaw with Maersk. They only had one endpoint initially compromised because it only takes one. If other vulnerabilities exist in your environment, the threat actor, they'll just pivot from one point to the other, find the other issues, pivot from there, and they'll keep working their way through your environment until they own it. And that's why it's so crucial to implement patch management, account audits, and vulnerability scanning policies. Then you need to have a review process to verify that your environment is in fact compliant with the policy and adjust policy or practice depending on the use case. It's a high bar for a lot of organizations, but here's the reality. It takes a threat actor on average 7 days to exercise a vulnerability. And it takes the average systems administrator 36 days to patch that vulnerability. Our goal through these webcasts is to change that narrative. We want to help you keep your businesses up and running and free of cyber criminals. Vulnerability management can be a lot of work if you do it yourself. If you'd like more information on how we can help reduce the time and effort, change the metric from 36 days to just a couple minutes, hopefully, that's something we'd be happy to talk to you more about. So just reach out to us.
Thank you, Graham. That's amazing. And this takeaway is so pertinent because not only are you talking about domain accounts, but how many local admin accounts exist in an environment where any one of those local admin accounts with a very simple password, users that have left the organization and have left an account on their machines, just one of those passwords could be used to unfortunately infect an entire environment. With that, Graham, I want to say thank you so much. This has been really useful for me. I have always enjoyed all of your presentations. I think we may have time for a question if we have any. I'm not sure, Jake, if we did get any questions, but just want to say beforehand, if we don't get a chance to answer your questions, we will privately reply to you. So if you've taken the time to ask us a question, or if you want to ask any questions now the webcast is finished, you can email us at info@syxsense.com. We will always reply to every question the best we very can.
So yeah, Rob, Graham and Rob, thank you so much for that content. It was really, really awesome. Just so the attendees know, we're going to, we've recorded this. We're going to email it out to everybody. So you have the ability to go back through and listen. You know, if you missed a few things, it's going to be really, really great to be able to re-listen to it and make sure that you take in all the content that Graham and Rob were able to give us. So I've had a few questions chatted to me. I wanted to see if you are on the call right now, please like chat a question in the chat if you have any. If not, then I can drop the question into the chat and read it for Graham or Rob.
Super duper. Well, I think we might have time for only one question, Jake. If you have any, we can answer it on the webcast. If not, then we'll let everyone get back to their day.
Yep. So I do have one. Are there any other precautions other than a restricted network that could strengthen security in a situation where updates/new versions aren't supported?
Great question. So I actually want to take a step back and talk about engineering implementation. So I think it's Edison, I could be wrong, sorry if this is true, but I believe it was Edison said that the design is not perfect when you no longer can add components, but when you can no longer strip components away. And so my advice to start would be see how critical that process actually is in your environment. Is there an engineering solution that you can design that makes so that you no longer need to rely on it? Because frankly, I've spent a lot of time in my career dealing with compromised environments and trying to triage them and make them supportable, even though they're no longer supported. And the reality is, it's a huge amount of time that you have to spend on that. When if you could find a better, more trusted vendor instead of your current vendor, generally it'll actually work out. Even when we talk millions of dollars, I worked in manufacturing in the past, we had those hard conversations. Let's strip out this $1 million piece of fabrication equipment and replace it with something new so that we don't have the churn of constantly reevaluating the security risk of unsupported hardware. So it's a hard pill to swallow, but that's my personal opinion. Almost always it'll work out long term and the best if you replace with supported hardware.
That's
Perfect.
a great answer. Excellent. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. We are going to continue the Masterclass series, and we are really excited to bring the next few Masterclass series in the next couple of months. If you've enjoyed it, we would love to hear your feedback, and from myself and from Graham and the rest of us at Syxsense, we wish you happy patching.
Thank you all.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye.
you.